Church planting is frequently championed as a sign of renewal and missionary energy within the church. In terms of entrepreneurial spirit, pioneering leadership, and dynamic growth. Yet beneath the vibrant language of innovation and multiplication, there exists a shadow side. Burnout, disillusionment, and dropout are increasingly common among those engaged in church planting. The vision may flourish, but the planter may not. One church planter told me how 5 years into their growing healthy church plant, only 2 of the original 4 leadership couples that started the church were still following Jesus. The other 2 couples had lost their faith entirely through the process of planting the church. The congregation had grown significantly, mostly through people coming to faith. It was financially stable and preparing to plant again. In many respects, this church plant was entirely successful, but only by those measures. That success clearly came at a high personal and spiritual cost for some. This story is not an anomaly, and in my work with church planters traveling and in various contexts, I have heard similar accounts, stories of ministry that began with joyful obedience but ended in collapse, whether emotional, moral, relational, or spiritual. And these stories do not occur in a vacuum. They reflect a broader crisis of sustainability in ministry. A recent Church of England survey found that over 1/3 of clergy had experienced symptoms of clinical depression in the previous 5 years. Among younger clergy, nearly half reported higher levels of things that could be described the beginnings of burnout. One bishop described many clergy as being placed in impossible jobs. Henri Nouwen once wrote, "Exhaustion, burnout, and depression are not signs that you are doing God's will." Similarly, Eugene Peterson offered this stark warning. The word busy is the symptom not of commitment, but of betrayal, not of devotion, but deflection. The adjective busy as a modifier to pastor should sound to our ears as adulterous is to characterize a wife, or embezzling to describe a banker. Such insights ring true, especially in the context of church planting. And it's important to note that the danger is not limited to those whose efforts fail. A striking feature of recent burnouts that I've heard of is that success itself can be a contributing factor. Church planters may be catapulted through success into suddenly complex leadership environments that they are not prepared for. They maybe have to build organizational systems, raise funds, develop teams, preach very regularly, care for converts, and manage conflict, all while maintaining their own spiritual life. And when growth is rapid, the demands intensify. The leader's formation cannot always keep pace with the scale of this work or the development of the expectations on the leader. This can result in internal strain, pride, fear of failure, imposter syndrome, and fatigue. This is of particular concern in light of, for example, the Church of England's aspiration to plant 10,000 new Christian communities during this decade. While visionary and hopeful, this goal must be accompanied by serious theological and pastoral reflection on the sustainability of those who are called to lead such work. If the church does not attend to the flourishing of church planters, it risks building churches at the cost of the flourishing of its leaders. This tension between fruitfulness and cost is not new. The engraving on the screen is by an Italian artist, Pomerancio, and it captures a 4th century liturgical phrase, which you can read at the top in right, and it's in Latin. It reads, "They planted the church with their blood." The fuller phrase in liturgy is, "The apostles planted the church with their blood." a recruitment poster for church planting. It's possible this creedal refrain may have been recited weekly as a reminder of the apostolic witness, the identity and founding of origins of Christian communities, and the sacrifice that it required. As you can see, Peter is shown crucified and Paul beheaded. The inscription below reads, "Nero persecutes the church of God. Peter, prince of the apostles, is affixed to the cross. The apostle Paul is smitten with an axe." This stark iconography testifies to the dangers and dignity of apostolic ministry, and I suggest by association, church planting. Church planting was never safe. It demanded everything. So no surprise that Paul writes to the Corinthians. Paul, a church planter, says this: God has exhibited us as last of all. We are fools for Christ. We are hungry and thirsty, poorly clothed and beaten and homeless. We have become like the rubbish of this world, the dregs of all things. This is no sentimental portrait of ministry and church planting. It is a sober reminder that to follow Christ in founding new Christian communities often entails significant suffering. And church planters in the global south today resonate deeply with this. I know that because I've asked friends recently. For many, persecution, poverty, social ostracism, and even martyrdom remain normal as costs for the ministry of starting new churches. There is no illusion of comfort or acclaim. To plant a church is to embrace the costs of the cross. In light of these realities, perhaps the biblical account of Elijah in 1 Kings 19 becomes a possible theological lens for understanding pastoral burnout and restoration. You will know the story. Immediately after a great triumph, defeating the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel, Elijah is plunged into despair. Queen Jezebel threatens his life, and Elijah flees into the wilderness, emotionally and spiritually broken. He prays, "I have had enough, Lord. Take my life." Perhaps this is even a suicidal ideation. The emotional and spiritual cost has eroded the will to continue living. It is the cry of a weary servant who can no longer carry the burden of the calling he is following. Psychologist Christina Maschler defines burnout in 3 dimensions: exhaustion, depersonalization or cynicism, and inefficacy. All of these are present in Elijah's experience. He is physically and emotionally exhausted. He isolates himself, leaving behind his servant, his co-worker, and wandering into the desert alone. He expresses a deep sense of failure. I am no better than my ancestors. He's convinced that his efforts have been futile. I have been very zealous for the Lord, but the Israelites have rejected your covenant. And he feels utterly alone. Am I the only one left? Dietrich Bonhoeffer cautioned against the dangers of such isolation. Let the person who cannot be alone beware of community. Let the person who is not in community beware of being alone. Each by itself has profound perils and pitfalls. One who wants fellowship without solitude plunges into the void of words and feelings. And the one who seeks solitude without fellowship perishes in the abyss of vanity, self-infatuation, and despair. Elijah's collapse is not simply personal, it's vocational. He no longer wants to continue in ministry. His sense of calling has withered. He asks for release, and not just from ministry, but from life itself. This text, as an example, offers a deeply human portrayal of burnout, the toil of relentless ministry, the burden of perceived failure, and the ache of isolation. Yet it is precisely in this moment of vulnerability that God meets him. God does not rebuke Elijah for his weakness, nor does he immediately send him back into the fray. Instead, God restores Elijah through a holistic process addressing body, soul, and vocation. God's first response is practical. An angel touches Elijah and provides food and water. He's simply told to eat and rest, and this happens twice. Only after Elijah has regained physical strength does God send him on a 40-day journey to Horeb. God honors the limits of the human body. He does not demand spiritual heroics from somebody who is physically depleted. As one commentator notes, God provided what Elijah needed most: a gentle touch, food, water, and rest. Church planters today may need to hear this afresh. Rest is not failure. It is often the first step towards restoration. When Elijah reaches Horeb, God asks, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" The question is not inquisitorial, but pastoral. It invites an honest response. Elijah pours out his grief, frustration, and despair, and God listens. God does not correct Elijah's emotions, nor does he dismiss his pain. Instead, he allows it to be voiced again and again later in the same narrative. And this act of lament seems central to Elijah's healing. It draws him out of an inward rumination into a relational dialogue. And church planters too need spaces where lament is permitted. Spiritual maturity is not measured by the absence of pain, but by the ability to bring it before God. And then comes the famous theophany. God reveals himself not in fire, wind, or earthquake, but in the sound of sheer silence. The Hebrew phrase is difficult to translate, but the sense is clear. God is present, not in spectacle, but in stillness. For Elijah, who may have longed for dramatic vindication, this is reorientating. God is reminding him that the mission is not his to accomplish through force. It is God's work carried forward in hidden, quiet faithfulness. This is a vital corrective for church planters tempted to measure success by numbers, noise, or physical outcomes. God's voice often comes the loudest in silence, and ministry is sustained not by the abundance of activity, but by communion with God. Finally, God recommissions Elijah. He gives him new tasks: anoint Hazael, Jephthah, and Elisha. He reveals that Elijah is not alone, as he thought he is. There are 7,000 in Israel who have remained faithful. Elijah's isolation is countered with new connections. His burdens are shared. Elisha will walk with him and will eventually succeed him. So not a return to the same life as before, it is a renewed life, one that is reconfigured around companionship and delegation. And perhaps for today's planters, the message is clear. Do not walk alone. Build teams. Mentor others. Trust God with the future. Elijah's story possibly offers a paradigm for sustainable ministry. And for me, this is one I hope to explore through a research project, because actually little is known about the realities of what happens in the UK context when church planters face extreme pressure. Yet it's vital that we know that. 4 principles. First, that rest is a spiritual discipline. The God who does not slumber invites his servants to do so. Burnout often arises not from disobedience, but from overextension in the name of obedience. Second, honest lament is welcomed by God. Pain must not be suppressed, it must be spoken. Elijah's healing begins when he's invited to say, without editing, what is truly on his heart. And God speaks in silence. Ministry without contemplation becomes machinery. Church planters need spaces where we can hear the whisper of God. And fourth, ministry must be shared. Elijah was not meant to finish alone, and nor are we. Rowan Williams captures this, I think, beautifully. The first thing a minister has to say is not listen to me, but let's listen together. To be a minister is to be set free to take time for God and with God, and to help others to do the same, to live out the weakness of Christ in our material lives so that the power that raised him from the dead can appear, being not anxious, not having to fix everything or succeed at everything. The goal in church planting surely is not a blaze of activity, but rather a long obedience in the same direction. This paper has highlighted some of the challenges around flourishing in church planting and has explored one possible framework that might be useful in understanding failure to flourish and how those who are broken through ministry might be restored. It affirms that burnout is real and multifaceted, and it reminds us that even God's most faithful servants can fall into despair, and reveals how God responds with gentleness, rest, renewed perspective, and recommissioning. Further research is needed in at least three areas. First, theological, a renewed ecclesiology and vocational theology that integrates weakness, rest, and community. Second, empirical data on church planters' health, burnout, support structures, and long-term outcomes across different contexts. And third, formation, new models of training that prioritize emotional resilience, contemplative practice, and shared leadership. Thank you.